Good morning or afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to another exciting weather forecast by Adrian. And in this video, we're going to be doing more of a long range forecast and looking at what can we very well expect for the month of December based off the current conditions we are seeing in November and really what could that really foreshadow for December? Looking at the total connections, as well looking at the long range forecasts and models, and just gonna be looking at what are they all showing and what could this, like I said, current pattern really. This current pattern we are seeing right now carries on into December. What could that mean for the East, and as well, what could it mean for the West? So if you guys want to get a long range forecast on what could you very well expect on December, then I would recommend you guys subscribe to this channel, like this video, and as well hit the bell icon if you are new. Both without further ado, let's get into the weather forecast. So we're gonna be looking at really almost all of the teleconnections that really impact the United States, really winter significantly. So we're gonna be looking at, I believe we're gonna be looking at 4 teleconnections in the very beginning of the video, so you guys can get a better idea of what this current pattern is like right now across the globe and the overall conditions, and how it's gonna remain for the remaining of November, and how will this actually pass into December. So how will we really what are we gonna be entering the first day of December like, and what could that foreshadow for the future pattern of December? So obviously right now we are experiencing a negative Arctic oscillation right now, according to the European, and almost every single ensemble is basically showing that as well. So when we look at the European for this, you can tell we are in a pretty decent negative Arctic oscillation. It's a pretty gimme, because obviously we're about to see basically unfolding today and mainly tomorrow into Tuesday. We're seeing that major Arctic blast, which originated in the Arctic Circle, is now going to be making its way in towards the deep southeast and across the eastern and central United States. So obviously that is going to be a negative Arctic oscillation, as the Arctic Circle is currently under pretty warm high pressure, pushing that colder deep to the south, the United States. And then we're going to rise a little bit as we get towards later and towards basically the later this week here, as we're going to be seeing a slight ridge start to develop across the eastern United States. And then of course then we go back into another cold front by early next week, and then we go back and forth. But overall, the European wants us to kind of stay at a negative Arctic oscillation pattern. Even entering the beginning of December, we have a slight increase towards a positive Arctic oscillation, kind of favoring more slightly cooler air just for the far north central United States. It's going to be for the first day or so. Yeah, for like the first 3 days of December, and then they actually have it dipping it pretty far towards a negative Arctic oscillation. So we could very well be entering December in a negative or in a positive oscillation, but obviously at that point that would favor more of a negative Arctic oscillation eventually in maybe the second week of December. So it's gonna have to something we have to kind of foreshadow based on what we're seeing right now. So obviously towards really the rest of the remaining of November, we're gonna be seeing a negative Arctic oscillation pattern. But let's now go ahead and get a look now at the NAO. So obviously a negative North Atlantic oscillation will obviously favor cooler weather in the eastern United States, as you see a troughing pattern with a blocking high in the north central United States. And these are all kind of really are dependent on each other. So with a negative NAO, you're obviously going to be seeing a positive PNA, because the western United States is also going to be affecting that pattern. But with a negative NAO, you're gonna be seeing, like I said, a cooler eastern United States and cooler central and eastern United States, but specifically more toward the east, and that's obviously what we're about to see basically unfold the next day or so. We're obviously going to be continuing to trend towards a negative Arctic oscillation, a negative NAO, and then just like the Arctic oscillation, it kind of rises just a tad, but stays still at a negative status. And it kind of stays towards a negative status towards, like I said, the first week of December, or the first few days of December. We're going to start to see a really huge warm up all across the United States. They're going to be seeing a really warm start to December for the majority of the United States, at least I say the first 3 or 4 days. And then we go back to a negative negative NAO, which would obviously favor a cooler eastern United States. And we're kind of seeing a trend here, so you can kind of tell really after December 8th, you can see it starts to see a cool down across portion of the United States. You can kind of see the resemblance in the AO and the NAO. So could this very well start to start to really add up to the point where could we start to see in the second week of December, could we see a pretty cold eastern United States in a pattern where we're going to continue to see that stubborn ridging across the western United States? But the only way we're going to get a better idea is if we obviously look at the WPO and as well the PNA, which we're about to look at later on in the next slide. So with a negative WPO, which is a Western Pacific Oscillation, a negative once again favors a cooler Eastern, and kind of the WPO kind of favors more of an overall cold majority of the United States. It's not really East or West necessarily. And a negative WPO is completely different in the summer than in the winter, but in the winter, it kind of favors a pretty overall cold United States. You're going to be seeing a pretty weak subtropical jet stream there. Obviously, going to be seeing some pretty less amount of wind shear going on here. But WPO overall, the negative WPO in the winter is going to be favoring kind of a cold United States in general, not just west to east. But typically in a negative WPO, you will start to see some warmer spots across the very far Pacific Northwest. But obviously, we're going to be transitioning towards, or staying at a negative WPO towards really later this week here. So like I said, we're going to start seeing some ridging going on there across the western United States. And then obviously it's going to continue to push eastward by basically the day after Thanksgiving or so. And then we continue now to go back towards a negative, and then really deep negative, the 8th. Like, we're kind of seeing a trend here. Like, after the 8th, we are seeing some really good teleconnections that are going to be favoring a cooler United States. Here's the AO, NAO, and then the WPO. So definitely very interesting similarities between these teleconnections. Now, another pretty important teleconnection that we obviously have to look at specifically when it comes towards the linking with the NAO is the PNA, which is a Pacific North American, which is obviously the oscillation, another oscillation there. So this is going to be really focusing towards the ridging pattern and the location of the ridging across the Pacific Northwest. And I don't mean like the actual coast itself. I'm just talking about like the Pacific Northwest, like including there the Alaskan Bay, not just like Seattle and all that stuff when you actually talk about the Pacific Northwest. But I guess I could say the Northeast Pacific. And basically a positive PNA is going to be favoring ridging pretty far to the east. So we're going to be seeing some really significant ridging across the Pacific Northwest coast, and that's going to bring us some really dry and warm weather across the west. Because typically in a normal PNA, which will be more towards negative PNA, you're going to be seeing that ridging towards the Alaskan Bay, more towards British Columbia, and towards the actual Alaskan region. But when I say east, I don't mean the eastern U.S., I mean the actual eastern location, which would be the Pacific Northwest. So in a positive PNA, it's going to favor a pretty significant ridge pretty far east, where that's going to allow for some really good troughing and as well as some deep troughing toward the east and central United States. So really, in general, a positive PNA is going to be favoring cold and cooler weather across portions of the eastern and central United States. It's exactly where we'll be seeing actually going to be strengthening towards that positive trend, then going a little bit more towards negative later this week here, which obviously in other words will be kind of warming up a little bit across the eastern United States, and then it continues to really go to a really strong positive PNA. It's going to obviously really probably bring some significant troughing on the later portion, the second, or in the last week of November, and then it really warms up as we go to the first few days of December, which is obviously what we've been seeing in the trends, except in the other ones it would be negative instead of positive, and then right in the second week there after the 8th, which is exactly what we've been seeing trend-wise, is that we start to see now a cooler United States, specifically eastern and northern United States, with these teleconnections. So starting to see some really interesting trends within all of the main teleconnections. But let's now get into a more technical. Look into what December could hold based on now looking at the phases in the MJO and what they forecast for the winter. We're gonna be looking at December, January, and February because obviously the OND, which is October, November, and December, really wouldn't work for us really. So we're looking at DJF, which is December, January, and February. So we're going to be looking at the phases and how they're going to be really impacting the United States, and then we're going to be looking at the actual MJO phase in the future 15-day for the MJO progression. So I'm going to go ahead and just give you guys an overall rundown on what the current conditions are right now. So I believe your overall current MJO is around phase 6, kind of ish, more towards phase 5 currently. That's where we actually have the good overall VP signatures as well as some overall enhanced convection going on across that vicinity. And I kind of briefed all over that last or yesterday in last video, but basically phase 1, 2, and 8 really have a would really forecast a really cold United States here for these months, specifically towards December and January. And then you have maybe phase 5, phase 6, phase 3, and phase 7 that kind of more really forecast more towards a negative PNA pattern, a positive WPO pattern, and some overall pretty strong bridging across the southeast ridge. While then you have phase 4 is kind of just really, I guess, a really nasty positive AO forecast uh kind of signature. So you're gonna, if you want to have a really super duper cold based on these phases across the majority of the United States, which is what some of the long range models are forecasting, like the, I believe it's a European Weekly, the GEFS and the CFS. So you're gonna have to look for more phase 1, 2, or 8 in the MJO. And obviously, this is obviously going to change as we could actually go and, I guess, December actually plays out. So if we actually look at the overall, oops, I don't want to do that. If we actually look at the overall MJO current status right now, this is actually going to be including as well the 15-day future forecast on the GFS. So as you can tell, the darker shades were the overall highest percentage chance of the MJO actually being placed in, basically. So currently, right now, it's more towards phase 6-ish, more towards 5 right there. Here's a start, and it's going to kind of go towards really the center of that circle there. So it's going to that really dark shade. Now eventually towards really phase, closer towards phase 4. Still kind of staying across the Western Pacific in that case. But overall, the next 15 days is most likely just going to stay around phase 5, 4, or even 6. And if we go basically back to what that means, if we go now, if I zoom my screen a little bit, we know what back that means. Phase 4 is going to be that. 5 is going to be that. And then it's basically kind of, and then you have 6. So basically, we're not looking at a super good pattern right now with the overall MJO. But obviously, this is not going to be like the only factor into the actual, I guess, the actual play and the actual I guess you could say outcome of December, because you obviously have the teleconnections, but the MJO does play a big part. And as of now, the current phase the MJO is and is forecast to be in is not looking super duper great for December. However, again, we could very well start to still see some pretty intense ridging across the Pacific Northwest, and that could really impact as well the United States a little bit more. But with this MJO, we are going to be seeing we're going to be seeing probably a weaker subtropical jet, which would obviously favor some really good weather across the eastern United States and central United States. So definitely some really interesting overlapping as well as some counter arguments in both of these sides. But definitely a pretty interesting pattern as we look towards December. So now that we looked at the actual, all that technical stuff, now let's go ahead and see what the future long-range models and what they are forecasting. We're looking at really the CFS, European Weekly, and as well the GEFS extended. So this is going to be a rundown for basically the remaining November and really the majority of December. It's going to be a very quick overview on what each long-range ensemble is showing here. We're not going to be going into really great detail because this video will be unnecessarily long. But let's now go ahead and see what they're forecasting. So obviously, as we go as far as the next 7.5 days, we're obviously going to be seeing that troughing that we're obviously all well aware of across the eastern United States, and then intense overall ridging. Because obviously right now we're in a positive PNA stage, negative WPO stage, negative NAO stage, and a negative AO stage. But as we now go towards the beginning of December, like I said, we're going to be seeing an overall majority really warm United States. However, the CFS is doing something a little bit different than what the European is showing. They're actually showing really only a warm start for the majority of just the west and the central United States. And the reasoning for that, because you have that really strong troughing across the Gulf of Alaska, which is going to be forcing that ridge to actually go pretty far east. This is going to be leading towards a positive PNA pattern. It's going to allow for some really good troughing as well as blocking high in the north central Atlantic, which would be a negative ANO. So, like I said, the NAO and the PNA really rely on each other. So this would actually favor a pretty cold, really cold start of December, which is not what the majority of the other ensembles are showing. But this is towards December 8th, and as we now go towards really the second week of December, they're actually having now that pretty strong ridging across the eastern United States and a really massive trough across the northwest United States. So that would obviously favor pretty cold northwest for that second week of December. And as we now go to like the third week, now towards Christmas week, having some really weak ridging, all really not really too much apparent ridging across the east or across the United States in general. Actually, seeing some really good troughing, so this could very well favor a pretty overall cold December, late December for the majority of the United States. Not gonna be seeing anything too intense, but obviously it's because it's so far out that these models don't have anything intense really. But now we go towards the last day of December, having some really good troughing in the very end of the month all across the United States. So overall, we kind of go through a whole rundown. We're not going to be see anything too crazy ridging wise, only really for the first few days of December, and then like I said, then the models and the teleconnections start to favor cooler United States in general. We look at the actual surface temperature forecast in the next for the 7-day anomaly. You can just tell obviously a pretty cold start for the eastern United States, which is not really what many models like the GFS are showing, nor the CMC are showing, and that's going to be the medium range models, and we're looking at the long range, and they have something completely different, a cooler start to December for the eastern United States, and that really intense ridging across the central United States and the western United States. And if you go overall rundown of December, we're not going to be going through a huge forecast, but start to see a warmer week now. As we start to see it transitioning now in towards a positive NAO or positive AO, positive NAO. So we're gonna start seeing a pretty overall warm United States for the really first or more towards the second to the getting into the third week of December. And after that, we start to see a pretty dramatic cool down across the United States. So based on the teleconnections and the overall long range models, the start of December is pretty all over the place. However, they are all agreeing really on really one short time period of ridging, and then the majority of December is going to be remaining towards really some pretty significant troughing all across the United States here. So nothing too crazy, nothing that's alarming, super duper warm. And it's kind of weird because typically the CFS is really warm by, but the fact they have such deep cold air for the majority of the United States and as well as southern Canada, look at that. They even have like 15 degrees below average. They rarely have any this far out. Like they typically don't have cold fronts. They don't pick up on cold fronts that strong. So the fact that they're kind of having a pretty significant cold front all across the United States is pretty interesting as well. These are the CFS is not the only model, long range model that has that. But if you kind of just go from a speed run, only have like a really one warm week across the United States, and then you have just really good troughing. You have some good troughing in the eastern United States the first week, and then you're gonna have a really cold end in middle part of December all across the United States. So definitely very interesting. I mean, typically this is warm bias of a model, and they don't really have too much warm air for December, and the teleconnections obviously kind of have it. Like the NAO, like the AO, and the WPO, they all kind of having going towards a negative status after December 8th. And that's what we just looked at. So definitely pretty interesting similarities between the teleconnections and the long range models. So we now go to our speed run now for the GFS. They also have a pretty cold overall general December. So obviously you're gonna have that really cold trough or that really significant trough obviously this week, and we're gonna kind of skip towards really the beginning of December here. So we're gonna be seeing this is what the JFS is showing. They have a pretty similar start towards the compared to the CFS, having some troughing across the eastern United States for the first few days of December, and then they actually having that kind of not lasting as long as what the CFS is showing. They actually now have that ridging now towards the 3rd and 4th of December, and you see that really good troughing across the western United States to see a transitioning toward a different pattern. And then look at that. I mean, they don't have anything too crazy for the 8th or 9th. I mean, actually, the GFS is actually showing a really cold overall. I mean, December, they have really only troughing across the United States with some nice zonal flow on the second week of December, and really no ridging whatsoever. Look at the 17th of December, 18th, 20th. We really have mainly just troughing and very super duper weak ridging across like the Gulf of Mexico. But if we go to the actual surface temperature, like we looked at the last long range, you can kind of see that cold start very first 2 days for December across the east, and then we have that really intense ridging across the central United States, transitioning into the eastern United States, and after that, we start to see some really cold United States all across the northern United States, Northwest, Great Lakes. This is gonna be the 21st. And that cold is just going to stay, and actually it's become more widespread as we go on. Look at now towards Christmas, we have to see some really widespread cold air. So we are not looking at anything too crazy except for that one weekend middle December that's kind of pretty warm. But other than that, after that, we see some pretty persistent troughing. So definitely very interesting. And also something I want to show you guys is actually the surface winter forecast for the next 35 days. So here's the overall cover of snow for the next 35 days going towards as far as December 25th, which is Christmas. Look at all that snow cover here. I mean, the GFS really wants a pretty snowy December in general, having a lot of snow cover specifically across the northern United States. So we're looking at probably a very cold December based on what we're seeing right now for the north central United States. And then you have some snow in the far southern portion of the United States there. So very, very interesting. And then last but not least, look at the European. Now, I watched the European last because they're actually seeing a little bit more of a warmer December than the rest, so they kind of have some really, really strong ridging compared to the majority of the other models. So here's the first few days of December. Still, you see that troughing across the eastern United States, and then this positive PNA pattern here, and a negative NAO pattern. And then after that, we kind of start to see that troughing, same persistent across the east, pretty long toward the 7th. And then after that, we kind of start to see some persistent ridging. We're going to start, at this point, start to see more ridging than troughing across the United States in the second week there. You just see a lot of yellows going on. A lot of troughing is going to stay towards the north. So the Europeans definitely having a little bit more of a warmer December compared to the majority of the other models. And we look at the surface temperature, you kind of just see that. So obviously, first few weeks of December, it's going to be pretty cold for the eastern United States. And then you just see some pretty persistent warm air all across the United States until right the last week of December. But here's a look now at Christmas. You kind of see a lot of that colder air is just staying across the far northern United States, while in the CFS and the GFS, it kind of stayed all across the United States. But until really the second week of December, we don't really have any cold air popping off across any part of the United States. And then it stays pretty warm all across the south, the central United States, and it doesn't get pretty cold until the 3rd of January. But I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys later.